You know, one of the most beautiful realities of our relationship with Allah is that it does not depend on sound. It does not depend on eloquence or expression. You don't need the perfect words, the perfect timing, or even the courage to say something out loud. Because sometimes our hearts are so heavy that speech itself feels like a burden. There are moments when the pain is too deep, the confusion too overwhelming, and all you can do is sit in silence, your chest tight with emotions you can't explain. Yet, in that very silence, Allah hears you. He knows what you wanted to say before the thought even formed in your mind. You see, the mercy of Allah is such that it reaches you in the spaces where words fail. When your lips don't move, your heart still speaks. And Allah listens to that language fluently. Every sigh, every pause, every tear is a form of dua. Sometimes it's not about what we say, but what we feel with sincerity. The believer's connection with Allah is not confined to formal supplication. It's an unspoken bond between the Creator and the created, between infinite mercy and finite struggle. Many people think that dua must always be expressed through speech, that if you didn't raise your hands or say the words aloud, perhaps Allah won't hear. But the truth is, Allah's hearing encompasses what is hidden and what is manifest. He hears the dua you made in the middle of the crowd, but only in your heart. He hears the plea you never had the strength to verbalize in the Quran. Allah reminds us, and if my servants ask you can me, indeed I am near. I respond to the invocation of the supplicant when he calls upon me. Boss, notice Allah did not specify whether that call is loud or silent. He simply said, calls when he calls upon me, because to Allah, every whisper of the soul is a call. There's something deeply psychological here as well. Our silence often reflects vulnerability, a recognition that we are not in control. And that very recognition is the beginning of true submission. In our world today, where everyone is desperate to be heard, where voices fill every space, we forget that the greatest listener is the one who doesn't need to be reminded. Allah knows what you're going through, even when you can't explain it to anyone else. You don't need to construct your pain into sentences for Him to understand it. This is the comfort of faith, that Allah comprehends what lies beneath our silence, what hides behind our smiles, and what trembles in our solitude. When you sit alone, staring at the ceiling after a difficult day, and your heartache is in ways you can't articulate, that moment is not wasted. That silence is not empty. It is a sacred conversation. You might not hear His voice, but His presence surrounds you. You might not see His response, but His mercy is already at work, shaping circumstances, rearranging hearts, removing obstacles, preparing your soul. The dua you make in silence might echo in ways you will only recognize years later. And sometimes Allah withholds words from you for a reason. Because silence itself becomes a test, a purification. It teaches humility, patience, and the art of turning inward, of letting your heart speak before your tongue does. Through that quiet connection, your faith matures. You begin to realize that the loudest prayer is often the one no one else can hear. So the next time your heart is too heavy to speak, don't think you failed to make dua. Don't think your silence means distance. Allah is not like the world. He does not need volume to hear you. He listens to the whispers that even you can't translate into words. And perhaps, just perhaps, your most silent dua will be the one that changes your life forever. Silence, for many of us, feels uncomfortable. We live in a world that glorifies noise, constant communication, endless chatter, and an obsession with expressing every thought the moment it arises. Yet, in the realm of faith, silence can be one of the most profound forms of worship. Because in silence, you're not disengaged, you're deeply engaged, you're present, attentive, and surrendered. When a believer sits quietly before Allah, not to demand, not to justify, but simply to FB, that silence itself becomes a testimony of faith. It says, Ya Allah, you already know what I need. I trust you more than my words can express. Sometimes our silence is not a lack of faith, but its purest expression. To stay still before your Creator without rushing to fill the moment with words is to acknowledge His ultimate awareness. You are saying, without speaking, I have nothing to hide, nothing to prove. You see what is within me. And that is where the soul finds peace. Because the truth is, words often complicate what the heart already knows. There are moments when the act of speaking dilutes sincerity. But silence, honest, mindful silence, has a purity that words rarely carry. The Prophet A would spend long moments in quiet remembrance of Allah, showing us that silence in His presence is not absence. It is awareness. The early scholars would say that silence is a door to wisdom, because when you quiet the noise of the world, the heart begins to hear what truly matters. In the stillness, you begin to feel the reality of Allah's nearness. You realize that worship is not only in what you say, but in what you feel and how you surrender. There is a spiritual psychology to silence. It teaches patience to sit with your emotions without rushing toward distraction. It teaches humility to admit that not everything needs to be said, that Allah already knows. And it teaches presence to simply exist before Him, aware of His gaze, His knowledge, His mercy. When you stand in prayer and pause for a moment before reciting, that breath, that silence is worship. It's the heart aligning itself with the awareness that you are standing before the Lord of the worlds. Silence also refines your inner state. It removes the clutter that speech often brings. How often do we regret words spoken in haste or anger? Silence protects you from that, giving you room to reflect before you express. In the same way, when it comes to dua, sometimes the purest plea is made without sound, because silence forces you to connect not through language, but through sincerity. It removes the external and directs the internal straight toward Allah. And there's something else. Silence cultivates trust. It's easy to ask loudly, to cry out and repeat your needs, but real trust often manifests when you can quietly surrender. When you no longer feel the urge to keep explaining yourself to Allah, but rather rest in the assurance that He already knows, that He already cares, that His plan is already unfolding exactly as it should. That kind of silence is not weakness. It is spiritual strength. It's the silence of Maryam when she bore her trial, a silence filled not with despair, but with divine connection. In our age, we measure devotion by expression, but in Allah's sight, sincerity is what counts. And sometimes sincerity resides in stillness. So when you find yourself unable to speak, don't think your worship has stopped. When your tongue is silent, but your heart trembles with remembrance, you are still in conversation with your Lord. So let your silence speak. Let it be the space where your faith breathes, where your heart bows even when your words do not. Because in that quiet surrender, you may discover the most beautiful truth of all, that Allah was listening the entire time. Sometimes the most difficult part of making dua is not in asking, but in waiting. We live in a world that demands immediacy, instant results, instant responses, instant gratification. But Allah does not operate according to human timelines. His wisdom transcends our sense of urgency. When we make dua and see no visible change, our hearts often whisper, maybe Allah didn't hear me, boys. But that thought itself stems from misunderstanding who Allah is. The silence of Allah is never neglect. It is mercy operating in ways our limited perception cannot yet comprehend. Every dua is heard, every single one. The Prophet told us that there is no believer who makes dua except that Allah responds to it in one of three ways. Either He grants what was asked immediately, He delays it for a better time, or He averts a calamity that was destined to happen. But the response will come, not necessarily in the way you imagine, but always in the way that is best. This is a truth that requires spiritual maturity to grasp, because the heart wants what it wants now, but Allah gives according to knowledge that stretches beyond time and circumstance. When you say, "Wa Allah, help me," He hears it. But maybe what you ask for is not what will truly help you. Maybe the very thing you're pleading for will harm your faith, your peace, or your future. So Allah in His compassion withholds it. And in that withholding, there is mercy. We often confuse delay with denial, but to Allah, a delay is a preparation, a rearranging of life's pieces so that when the moment finally comes, it arrives with perfection. Think of Yusuf Indisila BTV Fi. He made dua for relief while he was in the well, then in the prison. Years passed before his freedom came. But when it did, it came with honor, wisdom, and reconciliation. The dua was never ignored. It was unfolding the entire time, silently shaping his destiny. That's how Allah works, subtly, patiently, perfectly. He responds not only to the words of your dua, but to the depth of your need, the timing of your readiness, and the purity of your heart. From a psychological perspective, this understanding is profoundly liberating. It teaches the believer emotional resilience. When you accept that Allah's silence is not rejection, your heart finds calm. You no longer measure His love by how quickly He answers, but by the faith He helps you build through waiting. Delayed responses train the soul to trust rather than control, to submit rather than demand. You start to realize that an answered dua is not an absence of Allah's mercy, but its extension, a form of divine training teaching you patience, gratitude, and reliance. Many people lose faith in the waiting. They assume that because they haven't seen a miracle, Allah hasn't heard. But faith is believing that the miracle may already be happening, just not in the way you expected. Allah might be protecting you from a heartbreak you never knew was coming. He might be granting you strength instead of solution, growth instead of ease. Sometimes the greatest mercy is not in getting what you asked for, but in being shaped by the waiting itself. So the next time you make dua and feel like nothing changes, remind yourself Allah heard you the first time. The angels recorded it. The response has already been set in motion. You just haven't reached it yet. In Allah's divine wisdom, every delay has a purpose, and every purpose leads to something far more meaningful than what you thought you wanted. Trust that silence, trust that timing. Trust that even when you can't see His response, He is still responding perfectly, precisely, mercifully. And when your heart begins to waver, tell yourself this simple truth. Allah never ignores a heart that calls upon Him sincerely. There's something profoundly beautiful about a heart that continues to make dua even when it feels unheard. That quiet insistence, that repeated whisper of La Allah despite silence is itself a sign of faith. It shows that deep down you haven't lost hope. You still believe that Allah is listening, that His mercy is still near. And that belief, that persistence in calling upon Him is one of the greatest forms of worship a believer can offer. Because dua is not merely about receiving, it's about connecting. Every time you raise your hands, every time you whisper a prayer in the darkness of night, you are reaffirming your relationship with the one who never leaves. We often misunderstand dua as a transaction. I ask, He gives. But in reality, dua is a conversation. It's a reminder to your soul that Allah is not distant. He is close, closer than your jugular vein. He listens, He cares, and He responds in ways that shape your destiny, not just satisfy your desires. To keep whispering to Allah, especially in hardship, is to proclaim your trust in Him. It's to say, even if the world has turned away, I know my Lord never will. The Prophet described how Allah descends in the last third of the night, calling out thus, who is calling upon me so that I may answer him? Who is seeking forgiveness so that I may forgive him? That divine invitation is not for the saints or the scholars alone. It's for every soul who has ever felt unseen or unheard. You don't need eloquence. You don't need perfection. You only need sincerity in those quiet moments before dawn when the world is asleep and the noise has faded. Your whisper reaches the heavens. It's a sacred intimacy between you and your Creator that no one else can experience or even understand. From a psychological perspective, dua also restores balance to the heart. When you turn to Allah, you are releasing the emotional burden of control. You are acknowledging your limits and seeking strength beyond yourself. It's an act of spiritual vulnerability, and that vulnerability heals. It prevents bitterness, it softens pride, and it realigns your focus. Because in dua, you are reminded that outcomes are not in your hands, but in His. You realize that hope is not found in people or circumstances, but in the one who created both. There will be moments when your heart feels tired, when the repetition of dua begins to feel heavy, when you wonder, what's the point if nothing changes? But understand this, the very act of turning to Allah changes you. Each sincere dua polishes your heart a little more, draws you closer a little more, and strengthens your faith a little more. Perhaps the purpose of your dua is not to change your situation, but to change a five of you. Think about it. Every prophet went through this process. Noah made dua for centuries. Zechariah prayed for a child until old age. Yunus called out from the depths of the sea, not knowing if anyone could even hear him. Yet every one of them kept whispering. Their consistency was not rooted in certainty of result, but certainty of relationship, the certainty that Allah listens. And when the time came, His response was beyond imagination. So keep whispering your dua. Whisper it when you're full of hope and when you're full of tears. Whisper it when you understand and when you don't. Whisper it when the world is loud and when it's utterly silent. Because every time you call upon Him, the angels record it, your heart softens, and your faith grows. And perhaps one day, when the timing is right, when your heart is ready and the path is clear, you'll look back and realize that every silent dua, every quiet whisper, every tear shed in prayer was never lost. It was always heard, always treasured, always answered in the most perfect way. So never stop whispering, because the one who listens never stops listening.